The wind howled through the jagged peaks as a group of 4 experienced explorers trudged through knee-deep snow. Their breath came in clouds, instantly freezing in the sub-zero temperatures. The sky above was a pale gray blanket, threatening another wave of snow. They were days into their expedition, searching for untouched routes through the desolate mountain range known to the locals as Katil Choti, the Killer Peak. It wasn't a name given lightly. Over the decades, many who had dared climb it vanished without a trace. As evening began to descend, the group's lead, Danish, raised a gloved hand. "We need to find shelter before the storm traps us," he shouted over the wind. The others nodded, their faces barely visible behind thick goggles and scarves. Their GPS tracker had started glitching an hour ago, and even their satellite phones were useless in this remote stretch. The only option was to scan the cliffside for a cave or outcropping. Fate, it seemed, had other plans. Sana, the team's youngest member, spotted something unusual through the swirling snow, a jagged opening between 2 ice-laden boulders. "There," she called out, pointing her hiking pole. The team veered toward it, using their pickaxes to clear a narrow path. As they drew closer, the opening widened into a small, frozen cavern. Relief washed over them. Shelter, at last. Inside, the air was still but heavy, the silence thick and unnatural. Their headlamps lit up the glistening interior, icicles hung like teeth from the ceiling, and a thin sheet of frost coated every surface. They set down their gear and began unpacking thermal blankets and heating packs, but something gnawed at Danish. His instincts were sharp, honed by years of climbing and surviving the world's most brutal terrains, and something about this cave felt wrong. "Don't go too deep," he warned, as Adil wandered toward the far end of the cave, drawn by what looked like a reflective surface. "Just checking for wildlife," Adil replied casually, but his voice echoed strangely in the chamber. He rounded a frozen corner, and then stopped dead. "Guys, you need to see this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The others rushed over, their boots crunching against the icy floor. As their lights converged on the wall Adil was facing, time seemed to freeze. Embedded in the ice, half buried but unmistakable, was the figure of a man. His eyes were open, staring blankly into nothing. His face was eerily well preserved, as though he had fallen asleep moments ago. Frost clung to his eyelashes, and his lips were slightly parted. He wore a torn parka, a faded red scarf still wrapped tightly around his neck. No one spoke for several seconds. Sana took a shaky step forward. "Is he real?" Adil nodded slowly. "Too real." Zishan, the team medic, knelt cautiously near the ice. He examined the man's posture, the way his arms were curled slightly inward. "It's a natural mummification," he said softly. "The cold, it's preserved him. Like time just stopped." Danish's gaze didn't waver. "How long do you think he's been here?" Zishan shook his head. "Could be decades. Maybe more. The snowstorms and the isolation, this place might have never been found." They all fell silent again, a deep, reverent silence, not out of fear, but out of the overwhelming weight of the moment. A human life, frozen in time, lost to the world for who knew how long, and now discovered by accident. As the wind roared louder outside and snow began to pile against the cave's entrance, the explorers realized they'd not only found shelter, they'd stumbled onto a mystery buried in ice. One that would raise questions none of them were prepared to answer. They gathered around the frozen man, not as adventurers anymore, but as witnesses to something hauntingly profound. In that icy silence, the mountains had given up one of their secrets, and demanded nothing in return. Not yet. Snowflakes swirled like ash in the air as the chopper blades sliced through the white haze above the mountain range. The news of the frozen body had spread like wildfire within hours. What started as a remote expedition had turned into a full-scale recovery mission, attracting forensic specialists, journalists, and rescue crews from across the region. At the heart of it all were the 4 explorers who had made the discovery, now huddled together inside a heated tent near the cave, their expressions grim, haunted by what they had seen. Below, the icy cliffs groaned under the weight of fresh snowfall. Visibility was low, and the cold was relentless, biting even through industrial-grade gear. Yet none of it deterred the rescue team. This wasn't just any frozen body, it was a perfect human time capsule. If recovered correctly, it could hold clues, stories, maybe even justice for a forgotten soul. The lead officer, Commander Farouk, barked instructions as his boots crunched over the frozen ground. Secure the perimeter, keep heat blowers on standby, and prep the drone for internal mapping. His team of mountaineering experts and forensic analysts worked quickly, unspooling cables, setting up lights, and preparing thermal equipment to safely extract the body without causing decomposition. Inside the cave, the figure still lay silently in the ice, untouched since the explorers had first found him. A portable floodlight cast a ghostly glow on his face, highlighting every frozen eyelash, every crack in the scarf, every thread in his jacket. Forensic pathologist Drive. Nayla stepped closer, breath fogging up her visor. Unbelievable, she whispered. He doesn't even look dead. He looks, paused. Cameras rolled as robotic arms gently scanned the perimeter of the ice block. Drones buzzed softly, mapping the exact layout of the cave. Every second counted. The temperature inside had to be carefully managed. A sudden rise in warmth could trigger rapid decay, while too much cold would make extraction impossible. The team decided to cut through the ice from the sides, using fine-tuned laser tools. As the laser sliced through the centuries-old frost, the air filled with a faint, sharp scent, the smell of age and silence disturbed. Slowly, piece by piece, the surrounding ice was removed, revealing more of the man's clothing. Worn-out hiking boots, a leather belt with a rusted buckle, and an old, frayed pouch strapped to his waist. A hush fell over the entire team when the man's body finally came loose, still curled as if in sleep, his hands slightly clenched. With extreme care, they placed him on a specially designed stretcher wrapped in a cryo-sealed body bag. The moment he was lifted from the ice, time seemed to resume. The silence broke. Cameras flashed. The storm outside howled louder, almost as if the mountain itself was reacting. Commander Farouk gave a short nod. Let's move. We don't stay here longer than we need to. The stretcher was loaded into the helicopter with a precision that suggested ritual. Even the crew, hardened by years of disaster recoveries, treated the body like something sacred. A relic. The explorers watched from the edge of the cave as the chopper's blades roared back to life, sending snow spiraling into the air. As it lifted, carrying the preserved man away, they felt the gravity of what they had uncovered settle deeper into their bones. Back at base camp, screens lit up across the media world. Headlines rolled across news tickers: frozen body discovered in Killer Peak, preserved for decades. Experts were already speculating. Was it a lost climber? A fugitive? A forgotten victim of an unsolved crime? Theories swirled, but answers would take time. For now, the recovery was over. But the story was only beginning. The man from the ice, once swallowed whole by the mountain, was back among the living, or at least the world of the living. And somewhere, someone might finally be watching the news, recognizing a face they never expected to see again. A hush settled over the sterile examination room as the body was gently lowered onto the stainless steel table. Bright overhead lights cut through the lingering mist from the cold transport, illuminating every detail of the man preserved in ice for nearly 3 decades. Around him stood a team of forensic experts, their breath held as they took in the sight: the pale, unblemished skin, the frozen beads of water on his cheeks, the clothes that looked like they belonged to a different era. Dr. Nayla, the lead forensic pathologist, pulled on a fresh pair of latex gloves and stepped forward. With utmost care, she began the initial external examination, documenting each item of clothing and every visible feature. The man wore a thick parka, sun-bleached and torn in places, with a once red scarf that had faded to a dull rust. His boots were cracked leather, soles worn thin, suggesting many miles walked before he met his fate. "What do we have here?" murmured Inspector Tariq, leaning closer to see. Dr. Nayla carefully unzipped the parka. Layers of old, tattered sweaters peeled away like the pages of a book, revealing secrets trapped since the day he died. In the left breast pocket, she found the first clue: a faded, crumpled photograph, edges curled and darkened by time. She placed it under the light. The image was ghostly but clear enough: a young woman, smiling softly as she held a toddler. Their eyes, bright and full of life, seemed to pierce through the decades. The name, Aisha, was handwritten in the corner, ink-smeared but still legible. The room fell silent. Whoever this man was, he had carried his family with him to the very end. Dr. Nayla continued her search, moving to the man's waist. Attached to his belt was a small, cracked leather pouch. Inside, She pulled out a rusted compass, its needle stuck pointing east. Next came the most intriguing find, a folded map, yellowed and brittle, covered in handwritten notes. Lines and arrows traced a path through the mountains, ending at a circle marked in red. Next to the circle, in spidery handwriting, was a single word, safe. Inspector Tarek frowned. What was he looking for? Or running from? As Dr. Nayla spread the map on a tray, she noticed something else inside the man's inner jacket pocket, a small, intricately carved wooden box, no bigger than a cigarette case. She lifted it carefully, the wood cold and damp. With a soft click, it opened to reveal a delicate gold locket inside, containing a lock of dark hair. The initials, M.A., were engraved on the back, worn but unmistakable. The team exchanged glances. This wasn't just an ill-fated hiker, this was someone with a story, a mission, perhaps a desperate attempt to return home or reach something hidden in the mountains. Every item told a fragment of a larger tale, yet none of it explained why he was alone, entombed in ice for so long. On the man's left wrist, drive. Nayla found an old wristwatch, its glass cracked but the hands frozen at 4:27. Could it be the time of death? One assistant wondered aloud. Doctor. Nayla shook her head. Or simply the moment the watch stopped in the cold. As each clue was catalogued and photographed, the sense of mystery deepened. The photograph hinted at loved ones, the map suggested a secret path or plan, the locket whispered of someone he cherished, and the compass spoke of a journey cut tragically short. But nowhere in the pockets or seams was there any identification, no wallet, no ID, no name. It was as if the man had walked into the mountains prepared to disappear forever. Inspector Tarek sighed heavily. We need to find out who he was. And more importantly, who he was running to, or from. The experts knew their task was only beginning. They would send the photograph through databases of missing persons, test the DNA from the lock of hair, analyze the handwriting on the map. Perhaps somewhere, someone still wondered what happened to the man who vanished 28 years ago. Perhaps the discovery of these items would bring long-awaited answers, or awaken old secrets best left buried in the ice. In that bright, sterile room, surrounded by silent observers and the soft hum of forensic machines, the man's belongings spoke louder than words. The mystery was no longer just about how he died, but about the life he left behind, and the untold story waiting to emerge from the cold. In a quiet village nestled between wheat fields and dusty hills, the television flickered in the corner of a small, modest living room. The tea on the table had gone cold, untouched for hours. The clock ticked steadily, its sound amplified in the stillness of the room. On the screen, a news anchor spoke in an urgent tone, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the ceiling fan. The footage was grainy but chilling, a body preserved in ice, perfectly intact, lifted onto a stretcher and loaded into a helicopter. A frail woman sat on the worn sofa, a shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her reading glasses. As the anchor spoke about the recovery of a man from a mountain known for its deadly storms, her breath caught in her throat. The camera zoomed in for just a second, revealing the face of the frozen man. The glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her mind reeled back almost 3 decades, to the day her son, Haider, left home with a map, a backpack, and a promise that he'd return in a few days. He never did. They had searched for weeks. The authorities labeled him an adult runaway, said he likely got lost or fell from a cliff. No rescue team was ever sent. The village eventually went quiet about it. Time passed, but she never stopped waiting. She whispered his name now, as if testing her own memory. Haider. Her daughter-in-law, Fatima, rushed into the room, alerted by the sound of breaking glass. Ami, kya wa? But when she saw her mother-in-law staring at the TV in stunned silence, she followed her gaze to the screen. Her eyes widened. Yay, Haider bhai hi. The old woman couldn't answer. Her hand trembled as she pointed at the screen, where a photograph had just been displayed, the same one found in the frozen man's pocket. It showed a younger version of her, holding her grandson, barely a year old at the time. She remembered taking that photo under the old neem tree. Haider had insisted on capturing the moment before he left. It had been the last picture he ever took. Fatima gasped. Ye wohi tasvir hai, jo unka paast. Tears rolled silently down the woman's cheeks as she nodded. Wo kabi baga nahi de, Wawapas Arahada. Lekan Pahar ne Uzi Lilia. News crews soon swarmed the village when word leaked that a family might have identified the man. Reporters knocked on their door. Microphones were thrust into their faces. Cameras captured every tear, every tremble in the woman's voice as she confirmed what she already knew in her heart: the man in the ice was her son. DNA testing was requested, and within days, confirmation came: the frozen man was Haider Ali, missing since 1997. His belongings matched. The map he'd drawn was based on conversations he'd once had with local villagers about a safer route home. The compass was a gift from his father. The scarf had belonged to his wife, given to him the night before he left. News outlets around the country broadcast the emotional story. Mother identifies son preserved in ice after 28 years. The headline stirred hearts, but for the family, it was never about headlines. It was about closure. It was about finally knowing that he hadn't abandoned them, that he hadn't simply vanished. The villagers gathered around their home, offering prayers and words of comfort. The mosque announced a special dua for the deceased. But in the heart of the mother who had waited nearly 3 decades, there was only quiet. A deep, heavy silence, not of grief, but of something deeper. A wound finally stitched shut, even if the scar would never fade. The woman sat on the chair that evening, her eyes on the horizon, where the sun dipped behind the hills her son had once crossed. Wo akilade, she whispered, lekan uski yadine kabi akeli nahi way. And for the first time in 28 years, she did not wait at the door, listening for footsteps that would never come. Because now, at last, she knew. The cold box was unassuming, metal, dented at the edges, no larger than a lunch tin. It had been recovered from the frozen man's backpack during the careful dissection of his belongings. At first, the forensic team thought it was some kind of storage for tools or food. But when Dr. Naila held it in her gloved hands and felt its weight, she knew it held something far more personal. She placed it gently on a table under controlled lighting, and with a soft click, the latch gave way. Inside, wrapped in thin layers of waxed paper, was a journal. The pages were stiff, edges frayed, but the ink had held strong, a miracle of preservation, thanks to the freezing temperatures that had acted like a natural time capsule. The cover was leather, cracked and darkened, with initials embossed faintly in the corner: H.A. Haider Ali. The forensic team watched in silence as she turned the first page. His handwriting was neat, steady, as if he'd taken care with each word. The journal began like a travel log: dates, coordinates, brief notes about weather conditions, terrain difficulty, and resting spots. But as she flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. There was something else here. Something deeper. Day 5. The snow came in harder than expected. I think I took a wrong turn. I should have seen the old watchtower by now. I have enough food for 2 more days. I'm trying not to panic. Day 6. I heard something last night. Not animals. Voices. Men, I think. I turned off my light and stayed still. Could they be locals? Or someone else? Dr. Naila paused. The room fell quiet. Everyone leaned in. Day 7. I saw them. 3 men, hiking fast, no lights, no gear. They didn't look like travelers. I stayed low. I think they're following me. I don't know why. I'm not even supposed to be here. Inspector Tariq narrowed his eyes. What the hell was he doing out there alone? Dr. Naila continued reading. Day 8. I can't go back now. The way behind me is covered in avalanche debris. I'm heading toward the southern pass. It's steeper, but if I can reach the ridge, I'll be visible to anyone flying overhead. If something happens to me, tell Aisha I tried. If I don't make it out, it wasn't the weather that got me. That line hit the room like a sudden gust of wind. A chill ran down everyone's spine. The theory that Haider simply died from cold was now in question. There was fear in his words, urgency, and perhaps even knowledge of something he was never meant to see. Dr. Naila flipped to the back pages. The final entries were scribbled, the handwriting jagged, as though written in haste. I found a cave. I'm hiding inside. They passed above me. One of them dropped something, a walkie-talkie. They were speaking in code. Military. Smugglers. I don't know. My hands are too cold to write much more. If this journal is found, please, don't let them erase me like they tried to. Remember my name, Haider Ali. A deep, heavy silence hung in the lab. No one spoke for several moments. Then Inspector Tariq cleared his throat. "We need to find out who else was in that region at the time." He mentioned a group, possibly armed. "That changes everything." The journal was carefully sealed again and documented as critical evidence. It wasn't just a travel record. It was a plea, a message from a man who knew he might never make it home. Who suspected he was being hunted. Who feared the mountains not because of their terrain, but because of the secrets buried within them. The press would be told later that a journal had been found. But only a few would know what it truly contained, the final thoughts of a man alone, freezing, hunted, but determined not to be forgotten. And now, nearly 30 years later, his words were being read. His voice was finally heard. And someone, somewhere, might finally feel the tremor of fear he once felt, alone in the ice, writing his last goodbye. A storm rumbled low over the mountains as investigators pored over Haider's journal, their minds spinning with questions. The entries had made one thing devastatingly clear: Haider hadn't died by accident. He'd been running from someone. The idea unsettled everyone involved in the case. What had he seen? Why had he believed he was being followed? And more importantly, who were the men he described in such desperate detail? Inspector Tariq sat in a cramped government office, his desk buried under reports, old maps, and yellowed case files from the late 1990s. He rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair as an officer entered the room holding a thin, dusty folder. "Sir, we found this. It's not directly tied to any missing persons file, but it might be related." Tariq took the file and flipped it open. It was a report filed in 1997, the same year Haider disappeared, describing a suspicious group of men spotted several times near the southern slopes of the Katal Choti Range. They weren't registered mountaineers. Locals had reported seeing them move at night, carrying heavy crates and using strange equipment. The file suggested smuggling, possibly arms or contraband. The report had been quietly shelved. No follow-up. No investigation. Now it all began to align. Tariq called in the regional police chief, who reluctantly admitted there were long-standing rumors about that area, whispers of a hidden supply route used by criminal groups during the late 90s. "We never proved anything," the chief said. But Haider might have stumbled onto something, and paid the price. Later that week, guided by Haider's map and drone scans of the area, a small search team hiked toward the location he had marked with a red circle, the place he labeled, safe. But what they found wasn't safety. It was silence. The air grew colder as they climbed, frost thick on every rock, the wind sharp and steady. After hours of trudging through snow and ice, the team arrived at the edge of a cliff where a narrow trail led to an outcropping hidden from view. There, tucked behind a curtain of icicles, was an old hut made of stone and rotting wood, abandoned but strangely intact. Its roof sagged under decades of snow, but the door still stood. It creaked open under the lightest touch. Inside, the darkness smelled of damp wood and thyme. Dust coated every surface. There were supplies left behind: canned food, rusted lanterns, and ancient blankets. But more disturbing were the remnants of radio equipment scattered across the table: a shortwave transceiver, broken headsets, and a logbook filled with codes, initials, and dates. A faded military map was pinned to the wall, its surface marked with red pins, most of them leading in and out of the same pass Haider had attempted to cross. Tariq stared at the wall, his breath fogging the air. This isn't a hiker's camp. This was a checkpoint. On a shelf near the corner, wrapped in a tattered canvas bag, they found a pistol, registered to a man who had once served in a border security force, dishonorably discharged in 1994. His name matched an alias mentioned in a few unsolved smuggling cases. It was a name that hadn't been spoken in over 20 years, but now, it was scrawled clearly in the last pages of Haider's journal. They had their connection. Haider hadn't been imagining things. He had seen something: men using the mountain as a cover for illegal movement, maybe even trafficking. And when they realized he knew, they chased him. He must have fled through the snow, seeking refuge in the cave. Maybe he'd hoped to circle back to the hut. Maybe he believed if he could reach it, he'd find proof, or safety, or help. But the mountain closed in first. As the search team left the hut, one of the investigators looked back, his face pale. "How many others have they silenced?" he asked quietly. Tariq didn't answer. He knew they had only scratched the surface. Haider's frozen body had not just reopened a cold case, It had cracked open a buried chapter of corruption, silence, and cover-ups. And now that the ice was melting, there was no telling what might be uncovered next. The village lay quiet under the weight of heavy clouds, a sharp contrast to the mounting storm of attention descending upon it. Satellite trucks lined the outer road. Reporters stood outside gates with cameras ready, waiting for new details, for a new angle to an already unbelievable story. But inside the small police station, something was happening, something that wouldn't make the news yet. Inspector Tarek stood facing a retired forest ranger, a man named Mala Bosch, whose hands trembled not from age but from the weight of long-held guilt. His eyes were tired, heavy with years of silence. For decades, he had lived a quiet life tending to his goats and trees, but now, with Haider's discovery making headlines, the memories had come back like an avalanche. "I remember him," Mala Bosch said, his voice low. "I remember the boy. He passed through my checkpoint in '97. Told me he was trying a shortcut through the upper ridge to get home faster. He had a map, a compass. He seemed smart, determined. Said he didn't trust the regular trail." Tarek leaned in. "Did you file anything? Report it?" Mala Bosch shook his head slowly, shame flickering across his face. "I did, but my report never left the outpost. 2 days after I logged it, men came to see me. Not in uniform. They wore black jackets, spoke in calm voices, but they weren't friendly. They said the boy had stolen something. Said he was being tracked and that I should forget I ever saw him. One of them showed me a gun, not pointed, just held it. Like a warning." He paused and rubbed his hands together, his voice cracking. "I was just a ranger. I had a wife, children. I didn't ask questions. I stayed silent. I thought, maybe he was a thief. Or a spy. I didn't know the truth until now." Tariq's jaw tightened. "They threatened you into silence. And now that boy's body was found frozen after 28 years. Mala Bosch nodded. "I still remember his face. He was tired, but he smiled. He trusted me. I never forgot that." The confession opened a door. It wasn't just about Haider anymore. If someone had threatened a ranger to stay quiet, how many others had been pressured, or paid, to bury the truth? Tarek authorized a deeper inquiry, and soon, more fragments of the past surfaced. An old truck driver, long retired, admitted he had seen armed men transporting heavy crates across the lower mountain path in the same year Haider vanished. A former local official mentioned he had once been offered a bribe to overlook irregular movement through forest routes. None of them had spoken before. But now, with the past staring them in the face, they found the courage to come forward. With each testimony, the story grew darker. Haider had not simply gotten lost. He had uncovered something dangerous, a covert smuggling operation using the harsh, remote terrain to move weapons and goods undetected. The men he had written about in his journal were real. And they were organized, protected by silence and fear. One clue led to another, until Tariq's team uncovered an abandoned military-grade storage shed built into the side of a hill near the southern pass. Inside were decaying crates, old radios, and several documents bearing names that had once belonged to border intelligence. Many of the files were half-burned, but enough survived to suggest a link between rogue agents, ex-military men, and a string of unsolved disappearances in the region. And at the center of it all, unknowingly, had been Haider. A simple man trying to get home. A son carrying a map, a photo, and a promise. Back in the village, his mother sat quietly on her veranda, watching the clouds roll in over the hills he once walked. She didn't need to hear the full story, her heart already knew. He hadn't been foolish, or lost. He had been brave. And betrayed. Tarek stood at the edge of her yard as the first drops of rain began to fall. He approached with quiet steps and knelt beside her. "We're finding the truth, Amma," he said softly. "Piece by piece." She looked at him, eyes filled with the pain of years, but also with peace. "He found it first," she whispered. "He just didn't live long enough to speak it. And now, the village that had once buried its silence would remember him differently. Not as a man who vanished, but as one who had discovered the darkness and tried to bring it into the light." The cemetery was quiet, blanketed by a light morning mist that clung to the grass like dew. A single grave, freshly dug and still raw in the earth, stood out among the old stones and fading flowers. Villagers gathered slowly, their heads bowed, scarves pulled tight against the wind. It wasn't just a burial, It was the end of a mystery that had haunted the village for nearly 3 decades. Haydar's coffin, small and plain, was lowered into the ground with care. Wrapped in white, his remains had finally come home, though time had stolen everything but bones and stories. Yet what they were burying that day was far more than a man. They were laying to rest years of silence, guilt, and unanswered questions. His mother stood near the edge of the grave, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face composed but unreadable. Fatima stood beside her, gently holding her arm. Inspector Tariq kept a respectful distance, watching with a heaviness in his chest. The investigation had uncovered so much: a lost man's final days, a hidden operation in the mountains, the betrayal of silence, but even now, some pieces refused to surface. The funeral prayers echoed through the hills, simple and solemn. When the final words faded, the villagers stepped forward, one by one, to place handfuls of earth over the grave. Haydar's mother knelt last, placing the same photograph that had survived decades in the ice, the one of her, holding her grandson, gently atop the coffin. She did not cry. She had cried enough over the years to fill rivers. But even as the ceremony ended and people began to leave, a quiet unease remained. 2 nights later, Tariq sat in his office, flipping once more through Haydar's journal. He kept returning to the last entry. "If I don't make it out, it wasn't the weather that got me." That single line was etched in his mind, haunting him. A knock on his door broke the silence. One of his junior officers stepped in, holding a sealed envelope. "Sir, this came today. No return address. It was left on the station gate." Tariq opened it slowly. Inside was a black and white photo, clearly old, but unmistakable. It showed 3 men in military jackets, standing near what looked like the edge of the same southern pass. One of them, the man in the middle, was marked with a red ink circle. Scribbled at the bottom in shaky handwriting were the words, "Still alive. Still watching." Tariq sat back, pulse quickening. He recognized the man circled. He'd seen him just last week, during the funeral, standing quietly at the back of the crowd, sunglasses on, head bowed. He had assumed he was an old friend or neighbor. But now, he wasn't so sure. He pulled out the photo again and looked closer. The man hadn't aged much. Clean cut, sharp jawline, same posture. It wasn't possible. Not unless he'd remained in the shadows, untouched by the justice Haydar had sought to bring. The message was clear: someone else was still out there. Someone who had been part of the network Haydar uncovered. Someone who had stayed hidden all these years, and had returned to watch the burial. To make sure the truth stayed in the ground with Haydar. Tariq stared at the photo for a long time before locking it in his drawer. The case, officially, was closed. Haydar's death had been ruled exposure due to extreme weather under unknown circumstances. The deeper truths, the hut, the smuggling ring, the evidence, had been filed under confidential reports. But now, Tariq knew better. He walked to the window, looking out toward the hills Haydar had once crossed. The wind rustled the trees below, whispering through the silence like a warning. This wasn't over. The mountain had given up one secret, but it still held others. And someone, the man in the photograph, wanted it to stay that way. Tariq lit a cigarette with shaking fingers and muttered under his breath, "You made it home, Haydar. But your story didn't end here." Far beyond the village, deep in the shadows of the mountain range, another storm was already forming.